Welcome everybody. On behalf of the Observatory on Latin America, I am very pleased to welcome you all to this public lecture of the Néstor Kirchner Fellowship. This is the 4th edition of the fellowship, and we are very pleased that we could maintain during the years the fellowship and the rhythm of work and fellows in the new school. The OLA was formally launched in 2006 by the current president of Argentina, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, and it is directed by Michael Cohen, who is not here because he is in New Delhi, just arrived in a conference that he had to go. I am pleased to present again, in this occasion, as in the other public lectures of our 9 prior fellows in the last years, the 3 main objectives of the OLA. The first is to study and to observe the process of political, urban, economical, cultural change in our Latin American countries. The second is to link institutions in the US and in Latin America, which are working to understand the challenges of building more just and democratic societies in a globalized world. For this purpose, we have created opportunities for Latin American leaders to directly express their views to a New York audience and not to have to be kind of interpreted by 2 or 3 journalists in the big media that are interpreting what it is happening in Latin America and mostly having their information for the most conservative and big corporations of media in our countries. Overall, the OLA hosted around 75 events from 2006 in the new school in Argentina, in Chile, in Ecuador, and in Mexico. And the third objective is to work together with institutions in Latin America to advance these goals. As you might know, the work program of the OLA is organized around 5 themes. First, this President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship Program, about which you will hear more. On the Move program, which brings speakers to New York, and we have, among many others, Tabaré Vázquez, when he was president of Uruguay, Ollanta Humala, when he was candidate to the presidency of Peru. We have Rafael Correa, president of Ecuador in 2011. We have Alicia Bárcena, the Secretary General of UN Economic Commission of Latin America, ECLAC, and we have Néstor Kirchner several times, and the last in 2010, almost only 1 month before he died. Another program is the Building Latin American Bicentennials, which held 2 international competitions about the issues of the celebration and commemoration of the bicentennials in our region. We published 1 book, and the second will be published very soon. We have another program, the 4th one, Design and Development Program, which is a 3-year-old interdisciplinary and collective program which is done with universities in Buenos Aires and in Bangkok. And in last September, we held here a 5-day international symposium, Making Cities I3, Innovation, Incubation, and Inclusion, organized through a collaborative work of 2 divisions of the New School for Public Engagement and the Parsons School of Design. We have a new initiative, the Cuba program, about which we had already on May an event to update the New School community about the status of changes in Cuba. Well, we are very pleased to welcome Ambassador María Cristina Perceval, Marita Perceval, Permanent Representative of Argentina to the United Nations. We are very pleased to welcome Ricardo Forster, Secretary of Strategic Thought of the Ministry of Culture of Argentina, and Professor Anwar Shaikh, Chair of the Department of Economics of the New School of Social Research. Before introducing our provost, Tim Marshall, I would like very much to give a special thank to the team of the OLA who worked endlessly with the fellow and organizing all the meetings, all the seminars, in the preparations and in all the works that the OLA is taking on. I'd like to thank the coordinator of the OLA, Desiree Vecchia, and the graduate and doctoral students, Belén Arce Terceros, María Carrizosa, Marta Susana Jaimes, y Cristina Handal González. I want to give a special thank to them, because without them, the OLA probably couldn't work. Now I am honored to introduce our provost, Tim Marshall.
Thank you so much. As you just heard, I'm Tim Marshall, Provost at the New School, and I really am delighted to welcome you here this evening and to kick off this evening's program. As you've heard, this is the fourth in the November public lecture series by our President Néstor Kirchner Fellow. The program was started in 2011 following the death of Néstor Kirchner a month after he spoke here at the New School, as you just heard. And this sadly turned out to be his last international speech that he gave. The New School, in partnership with the Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Buenos Aires, has financed this program through the generous support of a New School trustee, Julian Studley. The objective of the Kirchner Fellowship Program is to honor the late President Kirchner by supporting the professional growth of young Latin Americans who are undertaking or have completed a master's or doctoral degree and who demonstrate a commitment to public service, either in government or civil society. The winning fellows have so far come from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. At its August 2014 meeting, the final round jury announced the good news that it has decided to expand this program to include all of Latin America and the Caribbean, and also to add a fourth fellowship to the current three fellowships being offered, which is a great compliment to the whole program and a success so far. This evening's program, as you heard, begins with a lecture by Juan Martín Graña from Argentina, followed by comments from Anwar Sheikh, our chair of the Economics Department at the New School for Social Research, and from Ricardo Forster, Secretary of Strategic Thought of the Ministry of Culture of Argentina. Here to introduce Mr. Graña is Ambassador Marita Percival, Argentina's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Percival has a long professional history, having been a professor of philosophy, an elected member of the Senate of Argentina, where she chaired the Defense Committee, among other responsibilities, and later served as the Undersecretary of Human Rights in the government of Argentina. She was appointed ambassador to the United Nations by President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in 2012 and has served as a member of the UN's Security Council, of which she has also been the president on several occasions, including in October 2014. So it's now my very great pleasure to have you join me in welcoming Ambassador Marita Percival. Thank you.
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank again the New School for having us today, and welcome, of course, Mr. Juan Martín Graña, who will in some minutes present his work on reframing industrial strategies in Latin America. Let me thank Tim Marshall, Provost of the New School, and my friend Margarita Goodman, and the team of OLA, of course, because each new chapter of this fellowship is an enormous effort, but at the same time express your commitment to make this fellowship a sustainable presence in this university. So thank you for that, because sustainability is not only a challenge for development issues, but also in the academic life. Dear friends, I have had the opportunity to read Mr. Graña's papers, and I would especially like to highlight some aspects. Of course, the professor of economics, chair, Department of Economics here at the New School, Mr. Anwar Sheikh and Dr. Foster will be more concrete and specific than me, but because I read the the paper that Mr. Graña's well present and become the best, one of the best papers that the fellowship received this year. I wish to highlight very important points in your paper. Graña emphasizes the need to generate national enterprises in key sectors. He also believes that there is a need to focus national development plans in some sectors, taking into account the regional dimension through either Mercosur or UNESUR, and Juan Martín signals the workers as the starting point, the importance of generating a solid workforce with low unemployment rates. Finally, he advocates for policies that prioritize certain sectors with national companies at the core and a central role for the state, as well as bigger scale private companies, while protecting those sectors where small companies are not able to compete internationally. As you know, in 2003, with Néstor Kirchner's government, Argentina began a process of continuing strong industrial recovery, which is still being consolidated even under the complex and challenging international stage. This industrial recovery is the very essence of the paradigm shift that began in 2003. The decision towards industrialization is not only an economic decision, it is a political decision, a decision that points towards what kind of society we want to live and what type of country we want to have. Since 2003, Argentina has doubled its industrial capacity and also has achieved significant structural changes. Not only we left behind a primary production country, but we also left behind a country where the financial sector was essentially focused on speculative investments instead of serving creation, production, and decent work. Dear friends, economic growth and industrialization are priority objectives of the Argentine government, shifting from an economy of primary products towards one that can also produce value-added goods. Value-added goods. And this is our wish, our decision. And in many occasions, we have to fight against the wish of others that try to maintain our countries in an economy of primary products. So we produce added goods such as satellites, radars, airplanes, software. We have a law. We have adopted a law to promote the software industry, and so on. But not only sectors, laws, but with policies, concrete policies that have at their core the generation of decent and quality work as a way to build an inclusive and just society. Also, the importance of having a strong quality workforce and the objective of achieving decent work for all cannot be overemphasized. Let me touch upon briefly on the importance of the regional dimension, a dimension that Néstor Kirchner, as the first Secretary General of UNASUR, knew was key for the region. President Kirchner spent the last month of his life traveling throughout the region, advocating for regional integration, which he believed would be a decisive step for multilateralism, development, and peace. We must continue his legacy. We need to keep working to promote a strategic vision towards the industrialization of our region as a whole. Finally, and also very briefly, let me tell you that here at the United Nations, we have worked to promote not only decent work, social protection floors, because these issues are in dispute now. But also we work to promote an agenda that includes industrialization as one of the objectives towards sustainable development. In a few days, the ministers of industry of 133 developing countries, the members of the group of 77 and China, will be meeting in Tarija to discuss industrialization. So let's hope that we can continue working towards the consolidation of a model that will help us to generate more just and inclusive societies in the context of sustainable development. For all these reasons, my friends, I am happy, very happy, to present Juan Martín, who, through his investigation, his proposal, and analysis, helps us to think and reflect on how to build a better and more inclusive country. But because I teach at the university, I need to highlight that the English version does not honor the work of Juan, so I think that we need a better language to, to expand, to share your important contribution in this group, the G77 and China, and in this important chapter on the SDGs objectives that we have to debate during this year. And I think that your paper, your investigation, as the UNSAM and New School has decided, is a very important contribution. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I will repeat some of the words before, but I need to thank Ola, Margarita, Michael, Desiree, Marta, Belen, and Cristina, all the people that have been working with me here in New York. So they have been great. It's a difficult program to fit in just 2 weeks of work, but it has been an amazing experience, and I'm very grateful to be here. So, starting with the presentation, I know my English translation of the paper wasn't the best, but I'll take the comment. But since the title is Reframing Industrial Strategies, I'm from Argentina, and I'm going to focus on Argentina, but this is not based on a whim. Argentina was the country that, during the industrialization by substitution of imports, was the country that most advanced in a complex and diversified manufacturing sector, and also was the country that had the worst regression during the neoliberal policies since the 70s till the big crisis of 2002. So we have both extremes of those policies in Argentina. So it's the best scenario to analyze what are the consequences of one policy against the other one. So that's where I'm going to put data on Argentina, but most of the conclusions and the theory we're going to discuss are, with some minor changes, adaptable for the rest. Most common countries in South America, Central America and the Caribbean are different because of their relationship with the United States, but for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, the history is quite similar. So this is the presentation index. We're going to talk about Argentina, a little bit of how we understand those trends, the last decade, in order to put the context, the discussion in our nowadays context, and why do I think that industrial policy is the way to go, the challenges we face, and which objectives should we go around and get. So when we look at the manufacturing sector in Argentina, we see that all through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, while industrialization by substitution of imports was the primary policy in our country, GDP growth was quite important and sustainable. It grew approximately 3.5% annually through 40 years. But also, we created a lot of manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs grew at 3% a year through those 40 years. But on the downside, productivity from industrial manufacturing in Argentina didn't have a very dynamic growth. It only grew about 1.5% every year. Even just after the Second World War, we had a little downward movement in productivity. So this is a quick look at what the industrialization by substitution of imports achieved in Argentina. But let's look what happened after that in the neoliberal policies of liberalization of goods and financial markets, trade openness, and the rest of the story. You see that GDP stagnated around that 20 years since 1975 till the 90s, and then it grew, but in the 90s, that growth was really unsustainable, sustaining debt. We'll get back to that, and we have at last the big crisis of 2002. So, as you can see, the trends of both periods are quite different. If you see manufacturing jobs, what you see is a big downward trend that doesn't stop, not even when the economy is growing. So, the deindustrialization of Argentina was quite strong. It's similar, this trend is similar to those you find in France and in the United States, but for different reasons that we will discuss later on. If you see productivity, even though the neoliberal policies said that they were focused on getting a more efficient manufacturing sector in Argentina, productivity grew even less than in the period before, only 0.6% every year. So the manufacturing results, the economic results of neoliberal policies, it's quite bad. And if you see this orange line, it's the relevance of manufacturing on the GDP of Argentina. And you see it peaked around 1974, around 38% of the GDP of Argentina was coming from manufacturing sector, and that relevance came down to 18% in 2002. So the magnitude of deindustrialization is quite important. But in order to, you see the 1975 line that divides both periods. So if you see what has happened inside manufacturing, what has happened to the diversified, within diversification you see, this is the picture of value adding in manufacturing before the 29 crisis, before the Wall Street crash. And you see that food, beverages, and tobacco, where supposedly Argentina has comparative advantages, managed to have a relevance of 35% of manufacturing. This is mostly beef towards the United Kingdom. Those were the sectors that were most developed in Argentina, followed by textiles. But there's no much of the complex sectors of metal products or machinery, electrical equipment, and stuff. If we see now what was the picture in 1973, almost at the end of the industrialization, we see a far more complex and diversified sector. In the manufacturing, we have huge increases in machinery, electrical equipment. We see a lot of metal products, and also petroleum chemicals and plastics have a big increase through public companies. The state during the 60s invested largely on those sectors. But if we go on to 2003, the end of the neoliberal policies, we see that the manufacturing sectors reshifts back to where the comparative advantages must be. Primary food and beverages, petroleum, and chemicals, but every complex sector, metal products and machinery, goes down in the relevance. So it's not only a question of deindustrialization, but also of simplification of what the manufacturing sector in Argentina meant. These trends are quite spread throughout South America and during the same period. But that's not all that. We need to see what the social effects of industrialization and the neoliberal policies were. If you see, this is the wage share. The wage share for total economy, it's an index number. You see that it grew all through the industrialization process. So wages weighed even more every time, every year, even if the economy was growing. So wages were a big part of the Argentinian economy during that period. But on top of that, a most spectacular evolution is real wages. In manufacturing, real wages doubled during the 40 years of industrial substitution. If you see, again, what happened after 1975, the wage share has a downward trend, and watch out, these are the real manufacturing real wages. The first lamp is the last military dictatorship in 1976, that real wages plummeted 33%, the same rate that happened in 2002. So by 2002, manufacturing real wages were half of their purchasing power from 1974. So all through 30 years of neoliberal policies, the workers lost half of their purchasing power. That's quite a big astonishment, and it's quite unique in the world. But let's see other indicators. There you see the unemployment rate. During the last years, this is all the data that's available in Argentina. The unemployment rate was under 5%, and poverty, that little orange triangle, is just 4% in 1974. But if you look what happened then, it's an upward trend till 25% in the 2002 crisis, and poverty skyrocketed to 50% in the same crisis. So again, if you look at the two periods, it's quite clear that the policies, that the political aim of economic policy was quite different, and the results were also quite different. But most papers that analyze Argentina discuss the abandonment of industrialization only focusing on internal questions. What did the political economy of that moment imply to the class struggle and stuff like that? But I'd like to see what was happening in an international comparison. If you see now, let's see a little bit of the United States for the same period, same variables. This is the manufacturing productivity of the United States during the 30 golden years. You have a quite good upward trend. It's triple the dynamic in Argentina. And if you see real wages, they're pretty good too. They also grow a lot. But if you see the unit labor cost comparative with Argentina and the United States, you see that after a big increase, this is the loss of competitiveness of Argentina regarding the United States through the 50s, then we managed to catch up a little with the United States, but we never can go down the 100% index. That means that we couldn't catch up at all since 1935. So this is a big problem. Argentina was developing a manufacturing sector, but couldn't catch up to the United States. This will be an important issue that we'll discuss later on. And what happened after the 70s? The 70s are also important for the United States. The productivity in manufacturing in the United States grows quite quickly in the last 40 years, and real wages stagnate. So this history, it's probably more familiar to you. Manufacturing in the United States became more competitive by compressing down real wages and many delocalization to Southeast Asia. But those trends give that the unit labor cost comparative in Argentina and US don't change much. Why? Because Argentina had cut in half those wages inside the country. So the same competitiveness that Argentina had with the United States was through two very different processes. The United States hiked their productivity and kept wages down. We couldn't hike the productivity and we plummeted wages. So the history behind the competitiveness of both economies is quite different. I think an important way to see it is the relative productivity in manufacturing between Argentina and Brazil, and you see that a long-term downward trend since 1935. You have a 45% productivity in Argentina manufacturing relative to the United States, and it continues to go down even through the industrialization by substitution, and it ends around 15% by 2002. So how can we explain this? Well, one important thing in manufacturing is the size of those establishments in manufacturing. This is Argentina, all through the 20th century. The average establishment in manufacturing in Argentina has only 10 employees. In the United States, you have 50. So only taking into account employees, you have other measures, but there's not enough data to go back to 1935. Only taking on the account employees, you see that manufacturing sector in Argentina has structural issues. And on top of that, as you see, small establishments in Argentina account for around 80% of establishments in manufacturing, while in the United States, it's only 50%. So Argentina's manufacturing is really specialized in small enterprises that have to compete with international imports. So this is going to be a big issue that we're going to discuss later. So a little bit of summary. Till the 70s, Argentina developed, grew, generated a good quality labor market, but since then, Argentina lost its way, not only losing the manufacturing, but also really impoverishing labor and unemployment and poverty rose up. So how do you explain the different results, even if the structural dynamics of the Argentine economy haven't changed? So for that, we need a little bit of theory. Again, this can be also applied to Latin America. Let's start in the political economy baseline. You have competition. Firms need to survive in the market in order to sell their goods. The only way to do that is to push for lower cost. The main path for that is productivity increases, and in manufacturing especially, scale and scope are quite important. However, as firms differentiate, another set of mechanisms spring into action that guaranteed for the leaders a huge increase in their profits, and for those that lag behind, huge problems in their competitiveness. One is the higher growth of labor productivity linked to scale and scope, the economies of scale present in innovation and R&D, and the differential access on credit and commercial networks. So the problem here is that if Argentina has a competitive disadvantage, those firms in Argentina manufacturing would tend to go bankrupt. However, there are sources of extraordinary sources of compensation that can make up for that productive lag and guarantee for those companies to stay in the market even though they are not competitive. One is land rent. We're thinking here in the Ricardian Marxian framework, where natural conditions of production generate an extraordinary surplus that can be appropriated and redistributed. External debt as a way to get income from abroad in order to subsidize companies, and the purchasing of the purchase of labor power below its value, that is lower wages, lower quality, worse conditions of work. So if you look in history, and again, this is for Argentina, but also for Latin America, the main source of compensation is land rent. For all the history, the region has been collecting income from their primary exports and send them into manufacturing in order to construct a manufacturing base. There are several mechanisms to do that, mainly taxes on agricultural exports, and then allocating those resources into energy and transportation subsidies, negative real interest rates. So the economy, as being closed, and with that land rent compensating productive lag, didn't have many problems in Argentina, so it could grow as nothing happened. In that context, the availability of land rent possibilitated that external debt wasn't needed as a compensation source, and during the immediate post-war, the second war post-war, Argentine government canceled the whole of the external debt, and as we saw, real wages could manage to go up and really in a really important way. But something changed in the 70s. The most usual discussion around this is that Fordism and Keynesianism had failed to generate growth, so it began to be questioned, and neoliberal policies will better. Well, that is possible. We have a productivity problem also that begins to stagnate, but there's also a technological revolution, telecommunications and robotics, that allowed the companies to delocate production processes to poorer countries with lower wages, mainly Southeast Asia, and that changed the international division of labor. So when you see the process, and now we're trying to explain a little bit of the changes in the United States trends in productivity and wages, you see that the least qualified jobs in the United States were relocated to Southeast Asia. And that allowed the companies and conservative policies to hold down wages on the threat that to relocate even more production lines. But for the rest of the world, this process was not only a factor of disturbance, but also created huge competitive problems. We couldn't compete with the United States, even with the United States wages. The competition with Southeast Asia, it's going to be even harder. So what we see is, what we think we see in Argentina is that land rent wasn't able to compensate anymore the large productive gap. And so external debt became a source that was available. And the military dictatorship and conservatism in government in Argentina used the debt source a lot, and it became a structural limit for economic policies thereon, and wages, as we saw, enter a downward trend. But even if those sources managed to compensate the productive rate, the profit rate, sorry, of manufacturing companies, if you devastate domestic demand, there's no manufacturing that can supply that demand. And in a non-competitive manufacturing, as in Argentina, the only market that they could supply was internal market. So while cutting wages, you devastated the domestic demand, and so manufacturing collapses, even if the compensations are there. So Argentina lost both the economic growth and the good, strong labor market. So this is how we reached 2002. But what happened in the last decade, and again, there's a lot of similarities between Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and stuff. So same variables, but 2002, 2014, we get an important growth, even if we lost a little bit of the dynamic in the last years, but annual growth was around 5 or 6% annual. We managed to create some jobs, a lot of jobs in comparison, but not as many as in the industrialization by substitution of inputs. And on the other hand, productivity went up, mainly because we were using capacity that was unused. So, however, these policies, this manufacturing rebirth, manufacturing kept declining as a relevant sector in the Argentine economy because other sectors, mainly primary, because of the international prices, were really high. That's the problem with economic statistics. Prices and quantities sometimes bring more shadow than light into what was happening. But if you see social effects of the last process, you see this is the wage share in Argentine economy. It went up really fast, and real wages also managed to climb. The real wages climbed around 2.5% every year. So this is an important recovery. If you see unemployment, from the 25% of 2002, unemployment declined quite rapidly till the 7% around 2010, 2011, and stayed there, even in the context of an international crisis. And if you see poverty, it drops from 50% around 15 or 20%, depending on the index you use. So the social effects of the last decade are quite important. And there's, of course, this is not only a result of manufacturing, but also of a lot of social programs that were established in Argentina, as well in Brazil. That's why we have a lot of similarities. But, however, the structural characteristics of the sector haven't changed. The unit labor costs of Argentina relative to the United States have gone up. Why? Because Argentina is improving their wages and the United States don't. So competitiveness is becoming an issue. And if you see relative productivity, we are in the same picture. We are around 15% of American productivity. So we have a structural issue regarding how we manage manufacturing in our country. So how do you explain the last decade? Well, it has a lot of good things and a lot of not so good things. The first one is, well, we have recovered manufacturing sector, we have recovered manufacturing policies, especially. But the productive gap hasn't changed, and that is our structural limit for the Argentine economy. But in order to explain this, we need, again, to go back to the extraordinary sources of compensation. The historically high export prices that the region endured during the last decade and the restating of export taxes on those primary exports allowed the productivity gap not to be expressed through wages. So wages were allowed to grow because the competitive side of the economy was endured through subsidies based on land rent. And this expansion of social programs was really important in order to get poverty down and unemployment down. But since then, since the start of this process in 2003, economic conditions have worsened, mainly since 2011. Unemployment and poverty mainly have ceased to improve. We have a stagnation in those variables, and that's a big issue. We need to get those figures still down. So we are now facing another of these issues, these situations where compensations or the sources of compensation are reaching a limit in order to, are beginning to fall short of their need. The main expression of this was the fight against the agricultural producers in 2008 when the government tried to expand its appropriation on rent, setting higher export taxes, but as the Congress stopped it, we couldn't manage to get more resources from land rent. And also, in the last years, the downfall in international prices are diminishing the amount of land rent that Argentina is receiving. The hedge fund problem here in the New York courts is delaying the access of Argentina in the international financing system. The government has pledged that they won't use the debt, the external debt, as a source of compensation, but there's a problem. So if the other two sources of compensation are going down, one has to go up. And the one that is going up is labor conditions. Wages in the last year, sadly, given the devaluation in January, have fallen this year for the first time in the whole decade. So we are in a tough situation. But this is always the case in underdeveloped economies. There's always a compensation race against the need, and we are always managing a crisis on those two factors. And the only way to get away from those crises, those cyclical crises, is to resolve the industrial problem. We have to solve the productivity gap. So I think the main issue here is what we have to do, how we have to face that problem. So I think that looking back through the decade, you can understand that for the first 7 or 8 years, economic policy was focused on economic growth and low unemployment, which is quite understandable. We came from a crisis, so you need to get people to jobs. Then we will see what needs to be done. But when you understand which policies were in place, you see that the exchange rate was one of the main policies. That's an horizontal and non-conditional policy because it affects every firm in every sector. You have low prices of energy as a policy, but you have a huge problem importing energy in the last years. You have interest rate subsidies for every kind of firm, national, multinational, small or big. And you have lower costs on wage goods in order to get wages to improve without inflating companies' costs. So all these kinds of policy are non-conditional or horizontal, are benefiting every company, even if they're doing something we need or not, if they're national or not. So I think that is the main problem. These type of policies are reproducing the structural bias that the economy has. So we're going as long as the compensation sources allow us, and then we hit a wall and we start over. So we need that industrial, goal-oriented policies to build an economy that doesn't structurally need those compensations. We have a bit of a challenge here. It's not just a policy decision that is easy to make. Given that we have compensations on land rent, we have a tendency to appreciate our exchange rate, what has become to know as a Dutch disease. If you picture that the Dutch also have this problem, you picture that it's not quite easy to solve. And also, during the 90s, the state capabilities were really weakened, not only because the state was taken out of a lot of fields of intervention, but also a lot of treaties, international treaties were signed that constrain the state in a lot of ways. The first example is the bilateral investment agreements that send the disputes with the Argentine government and multinational into New York courts, like the World Bank. So that's a big issue. We have the World Trade Organization that limits the kind of commercial policy we can do. And that's one of the main reasons I think the exchange rate has been the main policy, but It's not a good policy. And also Mercosur, that it's quite an important solution. It's not working as we need it to be. The economy, the asymmetries in the economies of the partners are getting all the investment into Brazil and not in Argentina. So that's a big problem. And as always, multinationals have interest groups that are pressing the government in order to go certain ways, and sometimes it's difficult to get political autonomy for the state in order to design your own policy. In that context, if we manage to resolve those issues that are not at all simple, I think that we need to start looking at which kind of sectors, which type of manufacturing we need to promote. And the first issue is there's no way that Argentina can manage the scale-intensive activities that the United States has or China has. We can't manage to get those scale. So we need to move away from those sectors. Also, low-quality manufacturing, that it has normally labor-intensive production processes where labor costs are really important, you can compete, or better said, you don't want to compete with China with lower wages. So we need to pull away from those sectors. So what can we do? Well, there's a lot of sectors, engineering-intensive sectors, design-intensive sectors, R&D-intensive sectors that don't have a scale problem. It's not the scale that gets the competitive edge to companies. So those are the sectors that can be improved and can get internationally competitive. I just put some examples there. Agricultural machinery is one. We have a lot of small and medium national enterprises in the sector. Medical equipment is another one. Pharmaceuticals, we have a lot of companies. And as we had the visit of the Minister of Culture just this afternoon, the cultural industries are a big job creation, and it can get value added to products and exports without competing with China or other countries. What we need? Well, in the sectors that need scale as machinery, we have to get that scale. And I think an easy way out, it's merging national companies. It's not a new idea. The French had done it just after World War II when de Gaulle merged a lot of national companies. It didn't work well on all sectors, but in some did. So it should be at least looked in. Long-term financing, Argentina is trying to get a national bank of development going for the last decade. It's difficult, but it's needed. The example of Brazil with Bandes, it's an interesting example. And we have to see how the new multilateral banks from the BRICS, CAF, the UNASUR Bank, are beginning to work on this issue. Infrastructure investment are needed throughout the underdeveloped world, so that's quite obvious. But in Argentinian case, that it sets apart from the rest of the region, except maybe for Uruguay, the qualified human resources are not a big need. They're not a big problem in the short run. So that's one we have checked out. Changes in law. I talked earlier about the treaties, the international treaties that Argentina signed that constrain the state. Well, we need changes in law. And if we need to change law in patents and in property rights, we need to denounce the international treaties now because they continue to work even if they're denounced. So that's a big issue. We need branding and marketing. The Argentine government has been developing an Argentina brand. We need to continue that. Another way is the protected designation of origin of agricultural products that France and Spain are doing quite well, but Argentina should too. And as I said, public companies in key sectors, it's needed. In sectors that produce inputs for the whole economy, we need scale, we need competitiveness. And the only actor that can manage to invest in the scale that is needed is the state. So the renationalization of YPF and Aerolíneas Argentinas are the way to go. We need those companies to be leading their sectors in the way and pushing its chain of value, its national chain of value ahead. So I think I've covered much of this, so I'm just saying a few words of concluding remarks and then open up for the comments of Anwar and Ricardo. I think the main problem of Latin America is the productive gap. I'm an economist, you will understand my limitations, so I'll put the main issue in the productive gap. I think while we endure that productive gap, while we endure a structural economy that is not competitive internationally, we have to compensate it with several sources. If we don't want bad quality jobs, if we don't want low wage paying jobs, we need to solve the structural issue. There's no way around it. So that structural determinant will need to be addressed. And we have to answer the question where we have to put our money, because the Argentine government has been investing heavily in Argentinian economy, yet the results aren't there. Some results aren't coming. We need to wait and see, but the problem is that if we don't get those results appearing in the economy in the short run, most of what we have been doing begins to be questioned. And the state role in the economy begins to be questioned. And we are again put in the discussion if the state has to intervene or it doesn't have to intervene in the economy. And I think we need to move past that discussion in order to discuss industrial policy. But for that discussion to come, we need to show results. And those results come, sadly, from an industrial policy. So it's a problem that feedbacks on its own and gets this problem really complex. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I think I need a chiropractor because I spent so much of my time looking over my shoulder at this. I hope that comes with the gig, as they say. I want to thank Juan for excellent and knowledgeable analysis of history, data, and theory. And that is a very difficult task to accomplish, especially given that he goes outside the bounds of orthodox theory, and so he therefore has the task of explaining how things work in a non-traditional framework. I think the one thing that comes out for me from his presentation is how important it is to get the understanding of what markets actually do. And this, as you know, the economics profession has not been good at. And I'm not the only person to say this, though admittedly I have been saying it for most of my life. But now lately, people are beginning to say it also. So I don't get many opportunities to say that Juan and I have very important people on our side. Let me mention one. Recently, on the 25th of September, the editorial board of the Financial Times, which is not exactly a leftist paper, said that the economics profession has lost its way, is retreated from reality into ever more abstruse depictions of fictionalized and idealized world. And it makes a point that really most textbooks continue on this. If you get an education in economics, you spend most of your life analyzing something which never existed and should not exist, but if you don't do it, you will not get your degree. So you spend your life looking at the mathematics of it, and forgetting that the object is, in fact, to look at the world and develop your theory from that. And if you are allowed to look at the world in economics in traditional programs, not ours at the New School, fortunately, then you do so by introducing imperfections. Let me explain what I mean by that. This is what I call the Garden of Eden project. First, there is perfection. You have Adam, you have Eve, you have an idyllic existence, plenty of fruits and vegetables, they're all organic, even the apples. So this is the ideal life. Then comes, at some point in the story, the snake, the carrier of imperfections, of realities. And this, due to the imperfect response of Eve, changes the world that they live in and brings us now to reality. This is exactly the path taken by any Orthodox textbook. I've just changed the name of the main characters, but the path is identical. All aspects of the real world that do not correspond to this Edenic ideal are considered to be imperfections. And as the Financial Times points out, this is the curriculum on which economists are trained. So my hat's off to Juan for having escaped from this thing, or having understood it, analyzed it, and having been able to stand up to approach it from a different point of view. Now, the alternate project, which is actually older than orthodox economics, is to start from actual society and derive theory from that. And here we have some rather big names also. We have Adam Smith, we have David Ricardo, we have Karl Marx, we have John Maynard Keynes, we have Mikhail Kalecki. These are people who are not trying to begin from some fictional world and then approach the real, but just the opposite. They started from the real and they constructed their abstractions from that. A famous physicist recently said, in a journal of economic methodology, he said, you know, people are always saying that economists are like physics. And he said, I'm a physicist, and you're not at all like us. What we do as physicists is we look at the real universe, and when we come up with theories to explain it. You look at an idealized framework and then come up with complaints about how the real world doesn't fit it. And that's not physics, definitely not physics. So Juan follows a second path, actually, which is the path, the older path, and also, in my opinion, the only proper way you can analyze reality, which is to deal with it from a foundation of real competition, which he mentions, and I want to elaborate on a bit. And then it comes to three critical factors that shape national development in Argentina. And these are the determinants of international trade, the balance of payments, the balance of trade, and the determinants of the exchange rate and the limits, therefore, to exchange rate policy. And he mentioned in the paper, though he didn't do it here, the possibility of inflation. What causes inflation? Because surely with Argentina's history, that is a very touchy and important issue. On the first issue, international trade. What's interesting to me, excuse me, one more point is what's interesting to me is it analyzes all of these from the point of view of a theory of competition. Now, if you are trained as an economist, you can't do that because competition is this ideal outcome. So how can you have the actual outcomes of a global crises and international trade causing pressure and leading to backwardness in some cases from purely competition? And the answer is, of course, that he's dealing with a framework of competition, which is the old framework in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and I would argue also in Keynes, which I call real competition, which is explaining how firms exist in a world in which competitive pressures surround them. Now, what's important there from that theoretical framework is real unit labor costs. And that's why the story here of the cost, unit labor costs, disadvantage and loss in Argentina in certain periods becomes very important because it's a mechanism for explaining both the gaining of competitiveness when unit costs are going down relative to your competitors, and then the loss of competitiveness when you either stagnate or go up relative to your competitors. The second point is that from this perspective of competition, it's possible to show that international competition operates in the same way as national competition. Now, what does that mean? It means that countries in which the firms have a competitive disadvantage in terms of unit labor costs will have trouble selling abroad. Now, if I say this to a business person or to a non-economist, a sociologist, a business leader and a political leader, they'll say, of course that's true. The problem is that in orthodox economics, it is not true. It is by argument not possible because the market will make nations equally competitive, even if their productivities and real wages are very different. And this is the basic principle known as comparative advantage theory from David Ricardo, a principle which has dominated the textbooks, dominated policies, dominated models, despite the fact that it has never been true empirically, and everybody knows that. But it continues because it is such a nice depiction. And this is what I mean of the Garden of Eden project. You like it, even if it's not true, you just like the idea. And that is not a good basis for policy because the people who get punished are not the people who have the wrong ideas, but the people who suffer the consequences. I like the old days when the magician and the statesman to the king were given a certain amount of what I would call negative feedback if they were wrong. And if they were seriously wrong, you would find them hanging outside the gates. So that gave you an incentive to at least deal with the real world. Second point along that line, the exchange rate. The exchange rate in this framework of real competition has a double effect, and this comes up in Juan's discussion, and it could be elaborated. We all know that if the exchange rate of a country depreciates, then all the prices of goods are produced for exports are thereby cheaper in foreign currency. So it seems that it's pretty clear it's an advantage to the exporters and a disadvantage to the importers, because for the same reason the import prices go up. But that's not right. And the reason it's not right is that the imports are part of the costs of production of the exports. So now you have a double effect. On one hand, the same mechanism that lowers your export price raises your cost and raises your export price. And if it were true that depreciation could make every country competitive, then every country that's poor would be competitive. But we know that what happens is depreciation. You get a temporary bounce, and then all the problems come back up, because the cost effect takes longer to catch up to you. And this can be shown formally, but it is all can be shown practically by tracing the effects of a depreciation on the costs. Juan mentioned one cost, which is real wages. That's a very important aspect of the cost of production, because if import prices rise, then either real wages fall because workers are too weak to catch up for this. A case in Mexico and Argentina in the past and so on. We know this, we've seen it, so that's why depreciation works. But if they are able to maintain their real wage, then the costs actually rise in monetary terms, because import costs are higher, wage costs go up to compensate for the loss of standard of living, and the costs of production are higher. At a purely abstract level, the two effects tend to cancel out, and so the exchange rate is not a long-term solution to a lack of competitiveness. The third issue, which is again related to these, and again comes from theory, is what about inflation? Juan mentions, I think correctly and very importantly emphasizes that the traditional view in Latin America is that inflation is caused by wages, because you have a model in which prices are based on wage costs and materials costs. But material costs are based on imports and domestic ones, but the principal one for inflation is considered to be wages. He correctly says that this is false. It's entirely possible to have a different theory of explanation of inflation. One of my students, whose name is Alberto Hanfas, who is from Brazil, used an argument that I made about explaining inflation in a different way and showed that it works very well for not only Latin American countries, but also for the developed world. Because we also have to explain the fact that inflation rose everywhere in the 1970s across the developed world, about the rich countries. There was a great era known as the era of stagflation. Slowdown of growth, rise of unemployment because growth slowed down, and yet inflation. And that was an era that raised lots of puzzles, which I would argue can be actually resolved fairly straightforward by a classical perspective. So let me come back to my first point, which is that the key thing about this paper, which is so important, is that it takes on the question of what markets actually do. And it takes it on not only by description, which is one way, surely, but by showing that there's an analytical foundation for the explanation. So what you get from the markets is what markets do. One could argue that markets are like nuclear reactors. They're extremely powerful, but also extremely corrosive, and they can be unstable. Do we forget that the crisis of 2008, in which Argentina is also enveloped, was developed here, in the richest country of the world? That's where the bubble broke and where the bubble was fed, and it spread across all the advanced world. So it's not true that it's just a problem of underdevelopment. It's a problem of the nature of the system itself. It creates these moments. It creates its own accelerated growth and then its own heart attack. And that's an important point to understand. Because when we're talking about Argentina and the world climate, this is not something that Argentina created, but Argentina has to suffer the consequences. And many other countries, obviously. So he makes the point that in competition, countries whose businesses, whose firms are less efficient can nonetheless survive if they can compensate for that lower efficiency by having lower wages, real wages, so that the unit cost can remain competitive. And if they have rich resources, the land rent part comes, it's high if your resources are cheap. But he correctly points out that both of these have limits. There's only so far you can compensate for losing ground on productivity by squeezing wages. Politically, it's a limit, and also just practically, it's a limit. Poverty can go up, and you can do it for a long time, by the way. Mexico's done it for decades, but still, there are limits to how far you can go. China, which has started with extremely low wages, has actually had its unit labor costs rising relative to the US because its wages have gone up from a very low base, and its productivity, having risen sharply, is now being caught up by the US. It doesn't mean that China is less competitive, because China's unit labor costs were much lower. And so even though it caught up, the costs have been rising relative to the US, they're still lower. And that's an important point. We need to look at the absolute size of that. You can, if your costs are lower, you can afford, so to speak, room for wages rising and productivity not rising as fast. Same thing for resources. Cheap resources have always been the promise given to developing countries. You don't have to be developed. You don't have to be as good as the developed countries. All you have to do is rely on your resources. Well, when the US was a resource-rich, cheap labor thing, the first thing they said is, we don't believe you at all. This is just an English trick to try to keep us out of your markets, and we aim to use these resources in order to develop our industry so that someday, and this is actually in Ha-Joon Chang's book, I think it's President Andrew Jackson says, sure, we'll talk about free trade once we are competitive, and when we enter the market, we can beat you. But until then, we're not so stupid as to fall for the free trade argument. It is a tremendous irony, of course, that the US is the greatest pusher of free trade now, given its own history of having blocked free trade until it developed enough. And Ha-Joon Chang shows that every major country, no exceptions, did the same thing. So why should we not take that lesson now? This brings a key point that resources are cheap for a while, but they're not cheap forever. They get used up. And so the trick is to use these resources, use these advantages in order to industrialize. And he's absolutely right to say that is the path that you have to take if you want to play in the world game. Now, perhaps you don't want to play. Perhaps you can withdraw from it, but it's pretty hard to do that nowadays. So let me then come to the question of the last question, which is industrialization and competition. There is a catch with industrialization, which is that raising productivity can lower the rate of growth of employment. I mean, this is a problem that we all recognize, and we all see it happening. I came from a talk recently where the speaker was talking about how everybody will someday be a knowledge worker. I don't think so. In fact, if anything, we're developing machinery so rapidly that the loss of jobs is concentrated in one part of the world and the gain of jobs in another part of the world. Now, if I'm just in Argentina, I can say, okay, we should be in that winning side. But if I step back and look at the world as a whole, then again, the issue which I raised before about crises comes about. What are the limits to these processes? Mechanization is not just displacing manual labor. It's displacing my labor. Everybody is pushing for mechanization, for teaching, mechanization for computer writing, all of that. And everybody thinks that we can use it to benefit, to win. But it's not necessarily true. There are going to be winners and losers, and that may be in the developed world also. The Chinese are very good at mechanization also, by the way. So we have to look at things that are in the medium term, possible benefits, and we also have to anticipate the longer term. And that means, ironically, and this is a question I just leave for you for the discussion, not only a path towards industrialization, but an escape from industrialization at some point, not just for environmental reasons, not just for reasons of health and safety, but also for the sheer question of jobs. How long can industrialization and robotization go before we run into that problem? Now, I have to say that two further things, I'll stop. One is that I'm a nerd. I went to Stuyvesant High School in New York City, if you know what that is. It's a science high school, so I'm an early adopter of scientific ideas, and it seems to me that this question of the fear of robots is the dominant question if you look in the movies. I always like, my favorite movie of this sort is Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, which has two advantages. It gives him within his acting range, because playing a robot is he's pretty good at that, and it tells a story. And what is the story? It tells us that the machines we made to save us from labor turn on us and say, we don't need you. And this is not a trivial issue. Today's New York Times has mentioned that the US and other countries are using drones, which are self-tracking. That once you drop them from the airplane, they make the decision which one of the targets they're going to attack on the basis of the highest probability of hitting the target. Now, that target could be a van full of children. The drone doesn't care. The drone's given multiple targets. It goes for the best. This is a small step in autonomous robots. And as we know, that is exactly what knowledge workers do. They're developing autonomous robots. That's what we do as academics. And that is something that we need to think about. I like the idea of increasing a scale of enterprise through mergers, though it's not clear how that could be done, but certainly states have done it. Regional cooperation, patent law changes. Patent law changes are definitely there to benefit the richer countries. And we know this because all the countries, like the US, simply ignored all the patent laws in the beginning, because as they pointed out, that would impede their development. So perhaps we should take a lesson from that. In the end, I want to argue that the issue of competition is an issue of understanding what markets do. And markets do good things and they do bad things. And the reason we need the state and the reason we need a policy attached to the state is that we need to understand how to channel the market as far as we can take it, at least. Argentina's central bank was one of the first ones to take on the responsibility that the central bank should be responsible for the outcomes of its actions in terms of employment and growth, not just its narrow charge. Now, all the central banks are following that lead. That is the kind of leadership that can come from Argentina and can come from Brazil, can come from many countries of the world which have experienced the downside of the market and have learned and are learning how to channel it. So I'm not a pessimist, but I don't think I could be called an optimist. Mm-hmm. I think there's room, some room for the future. Thank you.
Bueno, buenas noches. Pido disculpas por hablar en español, pero mi inglés no es suficiente para poder decir algunas cosas, así que habrá una traducción simultánea. Trataré de ir parando de a poco.
Good evening. I'm afraid my English would not allow me to present my ideas comfortably, so I will be translating, and Doctor will try to stop every now and then, so I can do that.
Agradezco la invitación para participar de esta presentación muy interesante de Juan Martín Graña.
I thank you for the opportunity to be here for this very interesting presentation by Mr. Graña and for the issues that were put in perspective by my predecessor, the previous speaker.
No soy economista, soy filósofo.
I am not an economist, rather a philosopher, so my point of view is rather different and will not go on the same lines, but will rather try to make a counterpoint between the visions of economy and politics. I think that Mr. Graña's work reflects a very important moment in time that is a mirror effect of two very important points in time. The first period is the substitution of imports, and it's not just an economic model, but it's also a political moment. It's a political change because of the formulation of Mr. Graña's presentation. He doesn't allude to it directly, but it's important to say that in the 40s there is a political ideal that breaks with previous political understandings, let's say. It's the coming of a tradition of populism that takes the name of Peronism in Argentina, and that has it's a conception and a word that has been vilified, but that explains a political situation. But this is passing from the invisible to the visible. The masses become an actor, start having a role, an important role, both in economic and political life. So this is a crosspath between economic and politics, which will be a constant reference in political life in Argentina thereafter. There is, within the society, there is a debate about how income is going to be distributed. There are two periods in time that follow for this type of populism, for this conception of politics and economy. The first time is the one that has been described between the 40s and the 70s, the first Peronism, and the second time starts with 2003 and has been very well described in Juan Martín's work in terms of offering very clear perspectives, data, statistics that show the uprise during the 40s, the upward movement, the upward evolution of economy during the 40s, 70s, and then the sudden and brusque changes during the neoliberal time. I will add a political interpretation of the panorama that was offered by Juan Martín's work from an economic perspective. In Argentina, liberalism is associated with authoritarianism, with a pause, with a hesitation in the enlargement of human rights. And but the breaking point is the political dictatorship, the military dictatorship, is the use of state terrorism as a tool for economic or market policies. The second moment of this period is what we can think of as the Latin American tragedy of the last 20 years of the 20th century. At the same time that democracy is regained in the south of South America, at the same time that the rule of law is back in place, from the economic point of view, there is a turn into neoliberal politics that make South America into a laboratory for neoliberal economic policies that lead to a fracture of the social fabric. I'm going to try to be brief, but one of the consequences of the political reconstruction in South America after this period is regaining traditions, economic traditions, thought traditions that had been passed over by the hegemony of the neoliberal theories. In the 60s and 70s, to follow Keynes or to be a neo-Keynesian would barely be to be pro-reform, to be a reformist. Today, it would seem it's to be a revolutionary. To vindicate the role of the state, in relation to markets, and this is very solidly, very emphatically pointed out in Juan Martín's work and with his research. So focusing on the state, on the role also of workers, of unions, the place of the struggle over the distribution of income as central to economy is now in a different way, where from South America we are coming with what would seem to be new ideas towards what's the general statu quo or the general state of knowledge in the north. I would like to add that it is also a big challenge, and Juan Martín does it very well in his work, to establish the link between the new democratic constructions, the new democratic ideals, and the challenges that the global market economy pose in terms of injuring or affecting in detriment of these ideas for social change, for human rights perspective in society. So if I may go back to my earlier point and also picking on what Anwar shared, it's crucial to link economy and politics. It's crucial to link economy and reality. And this is a challenge, for governments and also for university and academic circles, because we need to go back to the classics with the idea that it's impossible to transform society if we do not bring back economy to reality.
Muchas gracias.
Marita, give me the responsibility to open the floor. And thank you, Luz Mellon, because she's a great diplomat of our mission, the mission of Argentina to United Nations. And well, her leadership is on the agenda of the second and the third committee, development and human rights. So thank you for your effort and your cooperation. Well, the floor is open to questions. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Larry Bridwell. I teach international business in the MBA program at Pace University, and I love the events that the New School does here, and I love this presentation. I've been going to Brazil and to Argentina since 1999, and I love both countries. And I have watched what happened in Brazil since 1999. They had a period of high inflation. Then I know he's called a neoliberal, but Arminio Fraga took over the Central Bank of Brazil, and the inflation went way down. And I think the primary beneficiary of low inflation in Brazil is when I go into Sao Paulo, I see all of these apartment buildings, and a couple, like a nurse and a construction worker, are now able to get mortgages and buy their apartments. Because when there was high inflation in Brazil, they couldn't get mortgages. So one of the achievements of Brazil, particularly under Lula da Silva, is there's been low inflation, which has enabled working class people to get mortgages. So this inflation is a sensitive issue on many different levels. And I loved your presentation. I'm now speaking to Juan Martín Graña, and I appreciate this reality of markets, and that's why I bring up the mortgages for working class people. And so my question to you, with all of this extensive analysis, I'm putting you a bit on the spot, could you make a forecast of where Argentina is going to be 10 years from now economically?
Oh, thank you very much, Professor.
If you're wrong, can we kill you?
Yeah. Well, take your time. Yeah? Another question, yeah.
Oh, me? Okay.
Well, and then...
should I stand or?
No,
okay.
it's just...
My name is Sebastian Bacci. I'm a sophomore here at Eugene Lang College. I'm an economics major, political science minor. And the reason why I'm here today is because I'm really, really interested in Argentine economy. My family is from Argentina, and I was born here. And my mother is an economist. She worked on Wall Street for many years, and she worked in Argentina as well for many years. And I've been following the situation in Argentina for about 5 years now with my mother along my side. And my main question, mainly directed to Madam Ambassador Maria Cristina Perceval, Juan Martín Graña, and Ricardo Forster, is there have been many subsidies in Argentina over the recent years. Mostly, out of the top of my head, I can name subsidies given to per head of children to parents with low income, or to new mothers. And I want to ask you, is this not making the Argentine population being more dependent on the state instead of them actually working to get the minimum wage, since in some cases subsidies may be seen as a disincentive to work? And if you want, I can repeat this in Spanish as well for Ricardo Forster, or should I? Or
No, it's okay.
It's a traditional. Yeah, it's very important, your observation, because we usually hear these sincere description of policies that have the commitment of social inclusion, and we have here an enormous professor, Alberto Minujín, who sure he has a better answer than me, but I try to do so with Juan Martín. And well, another one, and oh, so sorry. Yes, the economists. Oh, the economists around us.
No, Valeria Iglesias from the Argentine Trade Office here in New York. I really enjoyed Juan's paper, but my question is, I have two hows. The first how is, how do you reconcile the short and the long term with that industrial reconversion in the country, especially in terms of the, I don't know how to say, wages and how to keep people employed. And my second how is, how do you introduce the factor of the international distribution of division of labor and division of production in your analysis? Because we can pick the winners, as we say, but also the reality of multinational corporations changes quite quickly. So those are my two how questions.
Wow, this is the mobility. Alberto, dear friend.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think that what Ricardo Forster said about the link between politics, because when you put the period, you say nothing about what is going on politics. And I think that that's an important part of this story. The other thing is the question of productivity, because always, I'm not an economist also, but always economists put the question of productivity, and the productivity, in my whole background, I was a mathematician, is two parts of the equation. One is the capital of the technological part, and the other is the salary. If you want to go up, well, the first thing is to put low the salaries, and you go up. And the second is put more technology. Mm-hmm. To complicate things. So if you go in that side, usually arrive to the neoliberal solution. That is to say, stagnation, even to stop the inflation. I would like you to elaborate a bit more on the question of inflation, because it's very difficult to say, how can we solve the question of inflation? Stagnation, so the people cannot buy, they don't have money, prices don't go up, control of prices never work, no? So very complicated. Doing economic policy in a political condition in which the unions has more power and the political situation go for more rights, it's very difficult, this tension. And one thing that I think that you should include there is this debate about the distribution and inequality that is not in your paper. I think that this is something that is a tension that probably in Argentina we didn't know how to solve, but around the world the solution is more for the rich and less for the other part of the world. No, the last Oxfam report showed that they are doing, I think every day 800 million or something like that, the 25 richest people, or something like that. No? But so I think that is important. The other thing that I want to mention only, I am very glad that you put culture as an industry after today listening to. But I think that you need maybe to include other things as in industry, that like tourism, like some other thing that usually are not there. So, and the last thing is what people is going on. I don't agree at all that the things like the thing that is not the subsidy. I think that is a wrong mention, saying that the salary, the family salary for children is a right and not subsidy. So I think that you should rethink the way that you are framing that. So.
Muchas gracias, querido amigo. One more? Okay. Well, two. Yes, of course.
There is room.
You have the floor.
Hi. Well, I actually, I'm kicking everything. I actually am a physicist, and sometimes I wish we were more like economists because we don't even know what ideal would be like. But I'm from Argentina. I'm doing a postdoc here, and I want to go back to Argentina. And I thank you very much for the presentation. I have a very small criticism that actually is connected to my worries, or not worries, but what I'm thinking about when I think about what I will do when I go back to Argentina, which is you made a comparison between Argentina and the US. I'm a bit surprised, but the reason is my question actually is what's the role of, what do you think the role of technology is over that effect of basically working force? Because if you look at the US, if you look at China, what they did is they managed, actually China, right? They managed to do the technology of the new way of manufacturing. I mean, right now you want to build something that you're going to sell massively, you have to build it in China because it's not about just the manforce, it's about the technology to make the production of a thing. And so if you think about what is structurally handicapped in Argentina's or many South American countries, I would think that is the technology. I don't know exactly what are the right technologies for us. What would be the model to follow? I've seen some of Chile's attempts that are very focused in very high-tech produced groups with the potential of generating great incomes, the startups. It's more or less the American model. Brazil has a huge industry and has some level of state involvement in that huge industry, which leads you to something else, which is my following question, which is, let's say you manage to solve some of those structural problems and you make your economy grow as a whole because you get your industry to grow. Then how do you imagine that you would prevent that growth to not be concentrated? Because that's another problem that you have to solve. Your economy grows, few people are going to have lots of machines, they probably get very profitable manufacturing places, wages are still okay, many people don't work, so you have to subsidize them. I mean, you have to help them. So the state actually has a role there in distributing that wealth. But how about something structurally heavier for just not having to distribute it, but rather making it more evenly produced?
Very interesting, and we can we can compare the situation in terms of equity and inequalities between the countries of our regions and the labor market and the more dynamic sectors of economies. I think that one of the most important categories for your observations that really are very important is the educational system in our countries, in the South American countries. Yes, Delasun, thank you.
When I was watching your excellent presentation, I thought about this book. I don't know if you've read it, about Haggard and Kaufman. They do an excellent contrast about welfare state designs in different countries. And what they said about Latin America is that the ISA, the import substitution industry, what created was a welfare system exclusive for the industrial workers, leaving out all of the other workers, for example, the rural workers that are very important in our regions. So when later such social welfares were tried to universalize, it was very hard because there was already a stigma surrounding the rural areas. Mm-hmm. So I just want to ask you, what do you think about concentrating not only in this industrialization, which is excellent, but also in those other workers outside the industrial regions, which are also part of our productive forces, and I believe they are frequently forgotten. Thank you.
Cute, your question. Yeah. Well, show your clever capacity to answer.
Well, thank you all for the questions. I leave the forecast, the 10-year forecast for Argentina last, but you will see why. But I think 10 years for Argentina is a bit much to ask, but I'll do my best. I think regarding the problem of inflation, I think all in all we have to ask ourselves, and I think Anwar was speaking on that part of the paper that I didn't get to present here, but I think inflation in Argentina is a result also of the productive gap that Chile and Brazil, for example, tried to solve the other way. Argentina tried to industrialize by protecting the companies, so the bigger companies get market power that allows them to pass wages into prices. Brazil and Chile didn't get the industrialization as an effect because they overvalued their currencies, so the international competitions keep the prices online. That's mainly in a broad spectrum why we have inflation and the other countries don't. But we also had very different social effects of the last decade. In Brazil, if it wasn't for Bolsa Familia, the social situation wouldn't be as good. So in Brazil, the social effects of the great growth in the last decade were primarily on social programs. In Argentina, the labor market played a huge role that in the other two countries didn't. And also in Brazil and Chile, you have the biggest inequality in the whole world. So that's when it becomes, yeah, but it's still one of the greatest in the world. Chile has an on average situation, the inequality we had in 2002. In the worst part of the crisis, we had the same inequality as Chile. And now we are 20 points lower. So I think the economy and the policies that we're taking to get the best of the high export prices is part of the answer to the question. As Alberto said, I don't think social welfare it's a big issue on the decision of the families to intervene or not in the labor market. A long time ago, I've done some research on Plan Jefas y Jefes, the first big social program we had in Argentina, and with the statistics, you found that only 2% of people that were receiving the benefit didn't go and work for the program. So I think it's a misconception because in underdeveloped countries, people don't get jobs, not because they don't want, but because those jobs don't exist. Good jobs don't exist. So you have to find a way to get good income into families by sharing the burden between bad jobs and social benefits. But on the whole, it's just a fairly low income for those families, and I'm sure that if you provide them with a good job, they'll probably get them and go inside those jobs. So I think I will think more in those lines. And reconciling industrial long-term and short-term, I think the problem, I think most of the policies now in action in Argentina should be sustained. We have to continue protecting textile industry and stuff, but we have to find a way to some resources that are put in there, start building the next economy, and begin a transition. As I said, there's not big educational problem in Argentina, so the transition should be smoother than in other countries, but that transition is another policy, more labor market policy, in order to requalify and maybe shift qualifications from the workers into the new areas. But that's part of the problem. And how do you get the best of global value chains in Argentina? I think that's where I put my bet on public companies. As public companies can shift demand as they please, and they can endure lowest profit rates since they are backed by the state, you can generate companies that provide inputs to those big public sectors, to those big public companies, in order to get them, these suppliers, into international competitiveness. So it's a two-way process, but I think the national or public companies' role is important in getting the best out of global value chains. We'll see next. With the question of Alberto, I'm not cutting away inequality in the paper. In the paper, sure, there's not the question of inequality. I come from labor market, so I know inequality, but I found that the problem in Argentina, it's not so much inequality, because we are a fairly equal country given the regional statistics, but we have an average problem. Real wages, average real wages are far too low to get the people in the labor market to a good income. So I think there's an average problem that we have to increase the average real wages, and then the main issue would be inequality. I think obviously you can't separate them, but I think even if everyone got the same in Argentina, incomes would be fairly low. So we have to work on both sides, not only the equality, but on the average. That's why I didn't try, especially on that, I think. Well, regarding technology, for the physics in the back, I'm not sure China has the technology yet. Most of the manufacturing in China buys most of technology outside, and its competitive edge is wages now, and it's going to be for the next 10 or 15 years. And you see this, that textile companies are moving away from China because China has become too expensive. And it has become way expensive because wages are climbing a little bit, but they don't have the technology to compensate that. So that doesn't cover the issue. We have to find what are we going to do with technology in Argentina? Are we going to develop ourselves? And what kind of technology? Yeah. I think you can manage technology to a certain point in order not to eliminate every job. You can in manufacturing. There's some room to pick your process of production that better fits the needs to create jobs. But I think the discussion is more which sectors. Some sectors have more labor intensity than others, and you have to pick those. I don't think technology is the answer. You can't build iron with a lot of workers. You have to, the room you can manage, it's not too big. So, and the problem, you said the next problem was technology on income distribution. How do you make a competitive economy if you have few jobs and highly qualified jobs? What happens to the rest? And I think the transition question before aims to that. How you manage to get everyone into those high quality jobs, high tech jobs. And that's a transition, and as Anwar put it, I'm not so sure that everyone fits in those high-tech, high-design sectors. It's a question. I don't have the answer, but I think that's mainly the issue. And regarding the welfare system, there's a difference in Argentina because we have a welfare state for urban workers, and we have one of the main discussions in the first Peronism was the social benefits for rural workers. So we had a social network for rural workers. But on top of that, since the 70s, there are no more rural workers in Argentina. The whole rural sector that produces soybean and stuff amounts for, as maximum, 500,000 works. And most of them are contractors that have machinery, so they're high-paying jobs. So that problem with rural workers in Argentina, it's not so much because we don't have many labor-intensive agricultural productions. We have some cotton, sugarcane, but they are protected by the social network for rural workers. So they have a welfare state on their own. It's not the best, and there's a big discussion regarding the links between the union of rural workers and the companies in order not to protect them. But it's a discussion, but on difference with other Latin American countries, the rural question in Argentina, it's not that big as you would think in, I don't know, Bolivia or Colombia or Ecuador. That has a difference. So coming back to the forecast, 10 years from now. The problem with your question is that you're coming 1 year before the presidential election. And this particular presidential election, I see this discussion being two-way street. Or we continue forward, trying to improve, trying to get those policies in the market, or we start over. And we go back to the 90s and start over, but start dismantling the state intervention on the markets. So the forecast in 10 years is, who knows? We have to see how the election plays out, the primary election in August, and then you'll get a picture. Maybe we try the Chilean way with a small state intervention and huge markets. We'll see. It's not painting up a really good picture for workers, that part of the political spectrum. And the other is, I think the government, the people on charge of government, realize that there's a lot of work to be done in order to continue growing, to continue improving labor. Those are two different trends. It's taken into the extremes. It's like we're back in 1975. Are we continue with the industrialization by substitution, but improving, or are we going to start over? I think that's what is in display next year, so I can manage to answer. I think I'm going to be in Argentina in 10 years, and I hope I'm in a fairly good country and not one in 2002, but it's just hope. I don't have anything else. Ustedes también les preguntaron a ustedes.
No corresponde.
Well, thank you very much to attend this important and, well, grateful moment in Ola's. And Margarita, thank you very much because this new edition really put in the core of the agenda that we are debating in different places, the responsibility that we have when we think and development and economical growth. And it's very important the observations that you, the ladies have done, because in Argentina we work hard, like you. We study a lot, like you, but we have vulture funds, not you. Well, but really, we try to share with you, not in a dogmatic position, because we the Latin American couldn't be dogmatic people. Passionate, yeah. Imaginative, yeah. Creative, yeah. But dogmatic, no. Because we suffered the dogmatism, the ideological dogmatism, the economical dogmatism, and also, I speak now as feminist, the religious dogmatism, for example, and sexual and reproductive health. So we try to build a democratical way of life, respecting the diversity we have without dogmatism. So sometimes we find a concrete and successful solution for a short time, a medium term, a long term. Sometimes we have the prudence to adapt, and say, how can we do this better? Who can help us, because in that place they are doing in a good manner this challenge we have. And in the case of the rural areas, we are not building countries to replace nature. Buildings, countries are the neighborhoods who, well, you see it's a process in our Latin American countries that the agriculture send the land because the agriculture nothing means. Don't make sense that you work in rural activities in agriculture. But I do have some experiences, not only in Argentina, but I come from a province, Mendoza, and we elaborate wine. It's very interesting. And we have different rhythms in our possibility to integrate the different cultures, the different needs, and the different demands of the real market. And for example, now we are trying with a strategic plan that we adopted by law in a national level, not to protect, to support, to promote the boutique wineries, but at the same time, the big players, for example, in wines of Argentina, they are global players with sophisticated technologies and few jobs. Well, they are in the same place, but at the same time, the smallest rural workers has the possibility to be integrated in a social economy under the framework of cooperative economy. So we are trying to do better. And I think that all around the world, the humanity is trying to live in a better conditions of dignity, freedom, and peace. 51 million people now are displaced people or refugees. It's not the case of Latin America. We are a region with peace. With inequality, yeah, but with peace. Thank you.